Well, thanks, Mitch. Good morning, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here and to share some thoughts about the challenge of managing innovation. Because, of course, it is a challenge. We've got a big problem with this word because it's everywhere. I'll give you 30 seconds on any company website before you're going to hit the magic word. You know the kind of thing. Innovation driving the business. Innovation working for the customer. Innovation, innovation everywhere. And in the public sector, it's the same thing. How do we deal with our challenges? Simple. Innovation. That's our problem. We know the word's important. What do we do about it? And that's very much what's brought us here today, a common interest in how we make innovation happen. How do we move from ideas to innovation? Now, I'd like to share some thoughts. I'm going to pull the lens out a little bit after that fascinating and, wow, mind-boggling set of things in the software. I'd like to look a little more broadly. And particularly, I'd like to begin by explaining my rather strange title. Now, as I get older, my reading seems to go backwards. So I'm spending a lot of time these days reading children's books. I love them. And one of my favorites is, there we go, Alice in Wonderland. Now, you might remember Alice in Wonderland, wonderful story. There are actually two books. The first one, Alice in Wonderland, and the second, Alice Through the Looking Glass. And in that second book, you'll meet a wonderful character who I thought was really rather interesting for today, the Red Queen. Now, there's one of the many pictures of her. This is from Tim Burton's wonderful film. But the Red Queen's an interesting character. And amongst other things, one of the lessons you could take from the book is don't play chess with her, because she's really hard. Why is it hard to play chess with the Red Queen? Well, first of all, because she keeps changing the rules. You start off playing the game you think you understand, and she changes the rules. If that wasn't hard enough, she keeps changing the game. So even if you're playing chess really well, she'll suddenly play a completely different game. And even more worrying, in her world, that's quite normal. Now, there's a lovely description in the book where Alice begins to understand just how hard it is in this looking-glass world where the Red Queen lives. There's this wonderful bit where Alice, who's been running, trying to keep up with the Red Queen, running really hard, she puffs and she says, "Oh, well, in our country, in my ordinary world," I said, Alice, panting a little, "you generally get to somewhere else if you'd run very fast for a long time, as we've been doing." To which the Red Queen replies, "That's a slow sort of country. Now, here you see, it takes all the running you can do to keep in the same place. If you want to get somewhere else, you must run at least twice as fast as that." Now, it's a wonderful story. I encourage you to read it, but I'd like to use it as a metaphor for what we're really interested in today, the challenge of managing innovation. Because in a sense, this looking-glass world is the one we confront. Innovation's an old problem. The problem never changes. There it is there. How do we create value from ideas? Now, the value could well be commercial value if we're in a business, but it can also be social value. Much of my research these days is with agencies like the Red Cross, humanitarian agencies. They're trying to create social value, but they're doing it through innovation. So there's our challenge, and it never changes, creating value from ideas. But what does change is the context. And we're basically in a world where we've got multiple simultaneous sources of change. I don't need to go through them. I'm sure you recognize all of them. But we've got an explosion of knowledge. $1,600 billion a year spent on R&D, creating new knowledge. Emerging markets growing at an incredible pace, adding billions of people to the equations we have to think about in terms of the demand side of innovation. Huge changes. So there's a lot going on simultaneously. We're trying to watch so many different things. We can't trust to luck. What we've got to do is to think about managing innovation. But one of the challenges we've learned is actually, even if we do put a system in place, it may not be enough. What we need to build is what we academics call dynamic capability. The ability to step back from the way we've done it and say, that worked in the past, but we need to change our approach because of this, because of that. So we need to have a kind of second-order management of innovation. Now, I was very fortunate when I started my career, a frighteningly long time ago, but in the late 1970s, I got involved with Sussex University near Brighton on the south coast, and I met somebody there called Roy Rothwell, who's one of the great writers on innovation. And Roy taught me a great deal about innovation management, but basically one of the things he wrote about in the 1990s I think is very powerful. He said, look, we have ways of thinking about it, mental models of how innovation works, and that shapes how we organize and manage it. And in the 1960s, they were really simplistic. We laugh at them today. You just do research and it somehow happens. Or you listen to the customer and it somehow pulls the innovation through. Dead easy. Simple linear models. As we got in the 1980s, we began to realize you actually have to join the R&D and the demand side together. And by the 1990s, when Roy was writing, we began to see it as a multiplayer game. Key suppliers, key customers, and so on. Roy wrote his paper in 1992, imagining a future model for innovation, what he called the fifth generation. And the key to Roy's model, essentially, was the kind of world we're now in. A world which is global in terms of its canvas, massively about networks and connections, hugely enabled by information technology, but as part of it, a tool that we're using. In a sense, this is a world which Roy imagined back in the 1990s, but we're now living in that. And in a sense, it's really the kind of looking glass canvas in which we've got to develop some new innovation models. So we've talked about business model innovation for decades now. What I think we might need to think about is innovation model innovation. Now, here's a picture, a little map. Some of you might have seen it last year, but I shall use it again. It's a very simple map. As you go on that horizontal axis, that way life gets more uncertain. Now, I don't mind what we put over there, technological change, market change. Life is harder that way. And that vertical axis, how far could we get away with doing what we've always done? Now, I suggest if you put this in front of anyone and say, where's your organization? They're going to say something like that. Don't be stupid. This is really about running to keep going. You may find one or two who say, we understand, and they don't. If we're clever, we can use the new technology or these new market conditions. We can create a new game. But the picture, generally, if you put this in front of anyone, is somewhere above that line. Of course, that's where we want to be and where we're doing our Alice, running as fast as we can to try and keep it going. But the evidence is very clear. It's very easy to get dragged below the line. Not because we're stupid. We may be very committed to innovation, but our models are out of date. We're beginning to lose the plot. My first job was with Kodak. Wonderful company throughout the 20th century, wrote the rule book around photography. I don't have to finish off the story, though you know where it's got to. In a sense, for Kodak and so many others, even though they were innovating extremely well, it wasn't enough. There's a need to have this additional capability to step back. Now, there's some good news. The good news is we do know something about managing innovation. We've been researching this for a long time, people like myself, but very much our laboratory is the world of practice, where you are. And we've learned a lot of principles. Thankfully, it means I've got a course to teach and I can write textbooks about it. But we know something about innovation. That's the good news, because we can build on that. And basically, the key message we've learned, it is not just bing, bright ideas. You all know in the cartoons that wonderful moment, bing, the light bulb flashes on. That's not innovation. That's ideas. It's really important. It's the front end. But on its own, it's not enough. What we need is some way of moving along, some kind of a process, whether it's stage gates or whatever the structure, some structured, systematic fashion to convert ideas to value. We can't guarantee success, but the evidence is clear. If we apply an approach that manages innovation, we're more likely to be able to repeat the trick. So I'm very happy with this picture. You'll find it in my textbook. You'll find it in hundreds of other texts. And indeed, most consultants will be selling a similar version of this. Fine, as long as we don't forget one very important point. And this is where the bad news comes in. Because innovation doesn't happen like that. That's a nice picture, but the reality of innovation is it happens like that. Now, don't worry if you can't see the detail. I just want you to see spaghetti, because that's what innovation is. Knowledge spaghetti. Technical knowledge, market knowledge, legal knowledge, financial knowledge, all sorts of strands of knowledge held by many different people inside and outside the organization. Now, our job in innovation management is to weave these strands together, all these different strands of spaghetti, to create value. That's the challenge we've got. That's what we're trying to do. And that's really where we start to need some new models. Because the game has changed, it's very much moving us into this looking glass space. Basically, if I summarize some of the key trends, the first one is we've recognized now how much of a multiplayer game innovation is. It's always been a multiplayer game, but we've now seen in the last decade or so an explosion of the number of people and perspectives that we need to take account of. And on the positive side, people whose knowledge might be relevant to what we're doing. It's a complex game, but it's very much about knowledge flow. Perhaps in the last century, the emphasis was too much on creating and owning knowledge. These days, it's very much about knowledge flows into and outside the organization. It's this much more fluid, dynamic picture. And it therefore emphasizes very much what Frank was saying. It's all about connections and about interactions across those connections. Inside our big organizations, does Procter & Gamble know what it knows? Does Nokia know what it knows? How do we mobilize that? And if that wasn't enough, not all the smart people work for us. There's all that knowledge out there. So there's this huge challenge to rethink our models in terms of flows of knowledge, managing the spaghetti. And it's not just about new knowledge. We've got so much already there that we're not making use of. If you think about 4 different situations, what does a hospital operating theater, a big car factory, a low-cost airline at an airport like Dusseldorf, and Formula One motor racing have in common? Well, nothing. They're all completely different worlds, except they're not. If you fly your helicopter high enough, all 4 of them share the same innovation challenge. How do we turn things around quickly? And what we're beginning to see is that knowledge that's been learned the hard way in different situations can be reused and recombined. In Great Ormond Street, our children's hospital in London, one of the big problems is using an operating theatre. Extremely expensive piece of equipment. You want to get high utilization. How do you do that? Well, what you want to do is get the patient in, operated on, and then out as fast as possible. Sterilize everything, clean everything up, wash the surgeons, get everything ready, new patient, start again. It's a turnaround problem. Now, on the Formula One racing track, of course, there's another one. The car screams into the pits, everybody dives on it, takes the wheels off, new wheels on, petrol in, wash the driver, wash the windscreen, vroom! It takes Ferrari 6 seconds to do that. So what has Great Ormond Street Hospital done in its attempts to innovate operating theatre utilization? Bring in the guys from Ferrari. What fascinated me about that was not just that the hospital learned many new tricks that it could apply, recombining that knowledge, but that the Ferrari guys went away saying, we've got some ideas we're going to take back to the racetrack. So maybe if you see guys in gowns and everything next time at the Formula One track, there's something going on. But it's recombining the knowledge we've got. It's a rich opportunity, but the challenge is how. How are we going to make this happen? And in a sense, the easy bit was giving the label open innovation way back in the beginning of this millennium. What we're really interested in now is how to make it happen. And Frank's just given some great examples of some of the things that are going on in this space around learning to work with these new models. Now, let me give you a different picture, just to set up the challenge. This is a frame we can put around our challenge for innovation. And I'll build it up as slowly as I can. So on our vertical axis, we have innovation. And of course, as we recognize, this could be incremental, doing what we do a little better, small steps. But it can also be a big leap into the unknown. Now, that's our dimension of innovation. And for a lot of the time, we're doing this in an environment where we're putting a frame around it. We're basically saying, okay, these are our customers, and they're our sources of knowledge, and they're our competitors. We put a frame around it, and then we learn to manage innovation within that frame. And we get quite good at it. Basically, there's a lot of useful tools to help us incrementally exploit the knowledge we have, push that frontier forward step by step. And we know quite a lot about exploration, pushing the frontiers, making some bigger bets into the unknown, but under controlled conditions. Now, this side we know about, and this side most organizations do reasonably well. It's the other side that poses the problem, because there's a lot more out there in the world, and increasingly that's becoming the stage on which we have to think about innovation. And in a sense, this is the looking glass world that I talked about in my introduction. This is where there's a lot going on, where we have to try and work in very different fashion, when we may not even understand the rules of the game. Now, if I get academic for a moment, that green space is where we see what are sometimes called complex adaptive systems. Now, don't fall asleep. I'm not going to go into great detail. But in a sense, the challenge of this looking glass world is learning to work with complex systems that interact with each other so we can't predict what's going to come out. And let me give you a good example, which you may recognize, of a complex adaptive system. Any of you with children might well have seen them playing on a bouncing castle. You all know the bouncing castle. It's a wonderful device for kids' entertainment. Now, if you look at a bouncing castle and you take one child and say, bounce on the castle, you can then use physics to predict where they're going to end up. They bounce here, boing, they'll land there. That's ballistics. You can work that out. If you put two children on, it's much more complicated because as one goes down, another one goes up. But you can just about, with clever simultaneous equations, work out what's going on. If you put 10 children on, you're lost because they bounce each other, they crash. It's chaos. That's a complex adaptive system. But it's not completely chaotic, because actually what sometimes happens is that one child bounces and another finds itself into the same place and they make a hole. And then the other kids fall into it. It begins to have certain patterns. So it's not a case of being totally chaotic, we can't do anything, but it has very different dynamics. That's an example, a very simple one, of the kind of system we're talking about. And what I want to do, I'm watching the clock like mad, I don't want to get things thrown at me. What I'd like to do is to suggest that we are learning some new tricks about how to manage this looking glass world. Strategies alongside, remember, we can still do the mainstream innovation management, we shouldn't forget that, but what else can we do? What other strategies might be helpful? And I'd like to suggest several with some examples. And the first thing we've learned goes back again to a nice piece of research. A man called Ross Ashby, way back, one of the founders of systems thinking, talked about the law of requisite variety. And what he basically says is, if you've got a lot of things going on out there, you have to try and match that variety. In other words, we need to mobilize many minds. Think about minds as the key resource, our knowledge. That's what we have to mobilize. Now, let me take you a little bit back in time to the 18th century. And we had a big problem in the British Navy, which was quite critical. We kept losing our ships. Now, that's not a good thing for a navy to do, but nonetheless, the British Navy had the problem. It lost its ships. And the reason for that was very simple. We couldn't navigate. We didn't know where they were, and they didn't know where they were, and sometimes they hit rocks or unexpected things. There was a real problem with navigation, which actually was down to telling the time. If you think about navigation, if you have latitude and longitude, you can work out where you are. We knew how to measure latitude. We couldn't measure longitude accurately because we couldn't tell the time. And this was such a big challenge that the government and the king himself decided we've got to do something about it. They set up an innovation competition. Huge prize, in today's money, about 8 million euros. Anybody who can come up with a reliable, portable timepiece that our ships can carry, there's the prize. And it worked. A man called John Harrison developed a wonderful design, beautiful, out of wood originally. You can see this in London if you ever have a little time. Go to Greenwich and you'll see Harrison's chronometer. And it won the prize. But the point was then, to organize that kind of competition was incredibly costly and difficult and took the authority of the king himself. Over in France, similar kind of challenge, this time in the army. Now, Emperor Louis Napoleon had learned from his grandfather, an army marches on its stomach. And so, problem with the army, of course, in marching along is they want some butter to put on their bread, to make their sandwiches, and butter goes bad. So bad butter doesn't taste very nice. What we really need to keep our army going is a substitute for butter. So once again, innovation competition, big prize. Can anyone come up with a substitute for butter? And that's where margarine comes from. Now, whether you like the product or not, it's in all our supermarket shelves. Its origins were another innovation contest. But my point about those two examples from a long time ago is that was really hard work then. To mobilize those minds was really difficult. Today, as we've just heard from Frank, we can do it. We can do it incredibly well. We can tap into all sorts of knowledge very, very quickly. So we've got all sorts of new ways of mobilizing minds. Innovation marketplaces. Innocentive is one. I guess there are many, many others. 9 Sigma. I'm not advertising any particular. Simply to say that now we can bring together people looking for solutions and anybody who thinks they may have an answer. The classic model here is you post a challenge. I'm looking for a solution to my problem. And anybody, it's like eBay, anybody says, oh, I've got an idea. I'll chip in. It could be a 9-year-old schoolboy, 90-year-old retired engineer. Anybody can play. That's the idea of an innovation market, eBay for innovation. Now, what's interesting about this kind of thing is not, oh, that's easy, we'll just outsource R&D. What we've learned from some excellent research by Karim Lakhani at Harvard Business School is that it doesn't work like that. It's not a case of companies saying, oh, we don't need to think because someone else will. The value of innovation markets like this is it's basically the long tail. Everybody in a company may be working on a problem, putting their best ideas in, but they can't crack it. But if you open it up to a wider marketplace, and there are 250,000 solvers active on Innocentive, for example, if you open your problem up to that much wider set of minds, somebody somewhere may be looking at it from a completely different angle and may give you a clue. That's the value of what's called broadcast search. It's not outsourcing R&D, it's stretching R&D. So, great deal going on, and of course, we see this in terms of innovation communities creating themselves around platforms like our mobile phones. So in a sense, there's a great deal going on in the world of mobilizing minds, but of course, we've got to learn how to use these tools effectively to help us deal with the looking glass challenge. Okay, second principle, very important in complex adaptive systems, is the concept of what's called emergence. And how might we work with emergence? And essentially, 3 principles. If you want to work in a complex system, you need to be in that system. You've got to place a bet. You've got to be in there early so you can see how things are developing and pick up early on some of those trends that might today be little but grow. And you've got to be actively involved, amplifying, feeding back, and learning in that context. Now, I'd like to suggest, with a couple of examples, that's very much what entrepreneurs do. Entrepreneurs are in early, they see something changing in the world, they think, I can take this forward. But it's not clear where it's going or whether it is going to work in the end. Now, this is one of my heroes. Sorry, it's a very faded picture, but this is a man called Dr. Venkataswamy. He's one of my heroes for a number of reasons, not least he was what's called a silver entrepreneur, so he was my age when he started his real entrepreneurial activity. Most of his life, he was an eye surgeon, and actually an eye surgeon with a problem of arthritis, which as a surgeon is a tricky thing, so he couldn't move all his fingers, so one of the things he did was to specialize in cataract surgery. And he spent all his working life in hospitals in India doing cataract surgery. He became a world expert on cataract surgery. When he retired, his challenge was, how do I take this surgery, which basically gives sight to people who would otherwise go blind, how do I take cataract surgery and bring that to those people in the poor villages where the daily income is less than $2 and there's no chance they could afford even the Indian prices, never mind Western prices. So what he did was to say, okay, my retirement project, I'm going to do this. Now, I've got to start, and he had a nice clear target. I've got to get the cost of this thing down from $3,000 in a Bonn hospital or a London hospital, $300 in a Mumbai hospital. I've got to get that cost down to $30. If I could get that, I could cross-subsidize, I could make this thing work. And so as an entrepreneur, he starts looking around. He basically finds a solution, not in the medical world. He finds his answer way, way out of that space under McDonald's golden arches. He looks at fast food, hamburgers, and said, you know, actually, they're doing something reliably, consistently, at low price, and with a guaranteed quality. May not be perfect, but it's guaranteed, I can do that. And largely using unskilled people, training them narrowly. That's a model we might adapt. Now, of course, the McDonald's people had already learned that from Henry Ford. That was Henry Ford's car factories. Apply car making to hamburgers, you get McDonald's. Apply McDonald's to eye surgery, and you get the Aravind system. Now, I'm not going to go into detail, but it's a fascinating and a wonderful story. But basically, the average cost of the operations in the Aravind hospitals is now $25. That's an incredible thing. Now, of course, you may say, but it can't be safe. Their infection rates, which is a very good measure of quality, their infection rates are better than most European hospitals. They do about 250,000 operations a year, so they're going up the learning curve. It is a very impressive approach to doing eye surgery. It's very different. It's essentially applying a kind of factory model to something which traditionally was more a sort of artisan kind of model, a specialist and a kind of art. Shifted that completely. Very much this idea of recombining innovation. But the story doesn't stop there. It's a wonderful story in itself about recombinant innovation. But the Aravind system's been going for 30 years. And it's integrated backwards. One of the big challenges was the cost of the lenses. Importing and buying those lenses added a huge amount to the bill. But eventually, working with users in context, they developed their own design for lenses, their own factories. They now export lenses to 87 countries. They're the world's biggest maker of artificial lenses. That model stretches to eye care and then eye education, eye prevention, various other things. The Aravind system has grown from a single entrepreneur to a system which is really offering a significant prescription, if you like, medical term, prescription for how we might look at healthcare on a wider stage. And it's not just Dr. V. This is another entrepreneur. This is a man called Devi Shetty. They call him the Henry Ford of heart surgery. He was Mother Teresa's physician for a while, and certainly he brought a lot to the party as a heart surgeon. But basically what he did was apply the same principles as the Aravind, manufacturing lessons learned from Henry Ford systematically in his hospitals, but mobilizing lots of different minds, continuous improvement. What you have today is the ability in his hospitals in India to do complex operations, never mind simple ones like cataract, heart bypass surgery, major stomach surgery, these sorts of major things at a fraction of the cost and with better survival rates than most Western hospitals. It's a fundamental shift, but once again, it's a system vision. It's grown from that into things like microinsurance. In a country where not many people have a great deal of money, he's developed a system where 12 million farmers pay 30 cents a day for full-scale medical insurance, for diagnosis and treatment. He's moved into telemedicine at a world-class level, so that now people like the Chinese are looking very hard. China has a huge problem. 500 million people are going to be converging on the limited hospital infrastructure in the next 10 years. Now, the Chinese approach to that, announced in 2014, okay, telemedicine. Let's not assume the hospitals deal with everything. Let's take the care out there. But what are you using for that? Huge advances in telemedicine grown in this kind of crucible. And this is an interesting thing, which starts to ring bells for me. This is the newest hospital in Devi Shetty's group on the Cayman Islands, just outside of Miami. Now, it's a small set of islands, and there are not that many sick people on the islands. The hospital isn't about treating the inhabitants of the Cayman Islands. It's very much to bring this model to the United States, to make it possible to get affordable, reliable, safe healthcare in a different way. This, I think, is going to be part of disruptive innovation in the world of healthcare. But the point I want to make is not about healthcare directly, but rather this is the idea of emergence. Entrepreneurs in there early, in the context, working with trends, working with constraints and so on, and developing a different kind of system, rather than imposing the traditional one we've always had. Okay, another strategy, very conscious of my timekeeping here, I've got to keep my eye on that. Co-create in context. The idea of users being a key part of the innovation equation. Now, here's a picture of a Model T Ford. Now, you probably recognize that, nice picture, but what you might see if you look a little more closely is that this particular enterprising farmer has nailed a few planks together, and now he has a truck to take his goat to the market. This farmer says, you know, I never use the back seats anyway, so I'll throw them out, and now I've got a truck to take hay out to the fields. And this farmer says, look, those iron wheels on the Model T are useless in the snows of the Midwest. What I want is a Model T snowmobile. And that's what you've got there. Now, none of these are photoshopped. They're all real pictures, and they remind us of something about farmers. Farmers are great innovators for two reasons. They really want something to work, and often they can't go to the shops and buy a solution, so they're going to try their own solution out. They'll try anything. It doesn't have to be perfect. It has to do the job. They have a high incentive for innovation, and they have a tolerance for it not being perfect. They're classically what are called user innovators, and there's been a lot of research over 50 years about this group, and they're very important. Because users carry with them ideas, but by definition, from the context in which they work. It's, of course, not confined simply to farmers. Many other examples. A lot of medical devices have grown up through this approach. But this guy's perhaps particularly interesting. He's a very classic user innovator with a very high incentive to innovate. In this case, he was dying. He had a heart condition. None of the major treatments available would have given him much more than about 6 months to live, so that's a pretty high incentive to innovate. And on the other hand, he was prepared to try something out. He's an engineer, he's got nothing to lose. He designed and then had fitted a heart valve. Thankfully, it worked. He's still alive. In fact, that's his name. If you know the TED Talks, you can see a wonderful talk by him on the TED series. But so are many other people alive as a result of his innovation. There's a great website in Portugal now called Patient Innovation, I recommend it, where users, people with chronic diseases or their carers have, in order to make their lives easier, high incentive to innovate, experimented and come up with solutions. And this is a really powerful resource for innovation. Of course, this we know. If you open your smartphone, it's running on Linux. Linux, of course, is a group of user innovators frustrated with existing software who continue to co-create world-class software. But I want to just briefly flag some examples from my work on humanitarian innovation. What could you do with a mobile phone? Well, of course, you can make calls and play games and so on. But in various different humanitarian context, huge amounts of innovation are happening on that platform. In Kenya, in East Africa, shifting money around, if you carry it cash in your pocket, it's not a good thing. Someone will knock you on the head and steal it. So the problem of transferring money in Kenya has been around for a long time. It led to the development of something called M-Pesa. Essentially, Swahili, it means mobile money. 40% of Kenya's gross domestic product now runs on the M-Pesa system, essentially using mobile phones as a banking system. That picture down in the corner there is after the Haiti earthquake. 2010, Port-au-Prince smashed to pieces. Everything broken, the infrastructure, including the banking system, all the ATMs and so on. The aid agencies were able very quickly to use mobile phones as a way of distributing money, as cash credits, using the M-Pesa kind of system, as a way of reuniting families who were massively displaced, as a way of mapping the crisis as it evolved and where there were hotspots and where all sorts of things going on. I like this one, summer source. Refugee camps, sadly, we're now in a world where we've got refugee camps the size of large cities. 500,000 people in a refugee camp is not an uncommon thing. And what you then have is a huge problem of what do those people do? a wonderful entrepreneur working with this idea said, well, actually, those are hugely educated people. If we could find a way to tap their minds, we could give them employment, we can get jobs done in the real world, and they can get resources to help develop an economy and develop the things they need for their families. Sama Source effectively is using mobile phones as a platform for doing it. I could go on with many other examples, but they're really an illustration of this challenge of users in their context coming up with ideas, but also shaping them. We often see users as a useful part of the front end of innovation. They're also important at the back end, because what goes on in innovation is it has to fit the world people are in. One of the big mistakes we make is assuming we know what users want. So engaging with users in this co-creation doesn't just help the front end, it helps that compatibility issue and the move to scale and diffusion. I'm running low on time here. Very quickly, probe and learn. Innovation is not always about success, it's about experiment and things not always working. Any of you like Toy Story or the other Pixar movies? Wonderful. Very successful business, but it's a business which is learned very much about failure, about experiment and failure. This is one of their geniuses. This is Pete Docter, who directed, got several Oscars for his films. His latest one is the Inside Out, you may have seen, but he did Monsters, Inc. and so on. But he says quite a lot about what they've learned about failure as part of the process. But I put in brackets, intelligent failure, not stupid failure, blindly doing something wrong, but learning from and seeing failure as part of the process. His comment, it wasn't until I finished Toy Story I realized that failure is a key part of the story. It's healthy. Actually, we learn through failures. Discovery means trying things out. We don't know the answers, we just have to try something. We probe and learn. Encourage people to play and spoof around. This kind of message is coming through. Colleagues at the University of Lübeck are working on a very interesting case of Pixar, but it's just one of many organizations. And of course, these days we see this in the literature. We have books called Serious Play or Experimentation Matters. We have the lean startup methodology spreading into mainstream businesses, all about failure, about trying and learning. The big challenge we've got, of course, is how do we make that happen, and how do we make sure it's intelligent failure and failure under controlled conditions? But there's a lot of places where this is beginning to happen. In particular, it's interesting to look at what I call boundary spaces, places where it's possible to experiment safely. And these are the kind of companies doing it. You probably know the big Chinese firm Haier. Haier have a very interesting exercise with the new maker spaces springing up in Shenzhen and various other places. Bright young entrepreneurs with lots of geeky ideas working together to create possibilities, and Haier working with them, because spinning out of that is essentially a prototyping space. BMW at the university in Munich, Technical University, in their Entrepreneurs Center, a great deal now in that maker space, that fab lab, a place where you can play with ideas. It's a safe space, but it's a space connected to mainstream players. GE doing the same thing in the United States with Local Motors, a community of what began as car enthusiasts, but essentially a bunch of bright people spread around a community, innovating, experimenting in that context. And I mentioned last year, place, if you're ever in Nuremberg, do visit Joseph's, right in the main street, nice little coffee shop, but also a space where, with support from the Fraunhofer Institute, it's possible to play in real worlds with the ideas you're developing. And the idea there is to bring people off the street to interact in this boundary space with some of the possibilities. They're laboratories for this probe and learn approach. Okay, I'm very conscious, I need to allow myself some time. The complexity toolkit. Well, thankfully, Frank did such a great warm-up, I don't have to go through this, so I'm going to skip this one slide, bear with me. We've got a lot of tools for this job now. Actually, to work in this space, we've got a whole set of things which we're learning to use more and more effectively. If you take Frank's talk, it's full of stuff, not just about collaboration platforms, but resources that we can use to mobilize minds towards this target. We're just beginning to learn what we can do with big data. We're understanding the power of innovation markets. We're looking at things like prototyping spaces. It's not just IT. Things like design thinking, design methods are important, and many others. Big challenge here, the toolkit is there, we've still got to learn to use it. And the last one, the last point, so I'm nearly finished, I promise, ambidexterity. Now, if would you put up for a moment your hand which you use to sign your name? So mostly you're right-handed, a few left-handed people. Now, if I were to ask you, I won't now, but if I were to ask you to sign your name with the other hand, you'd find that difficult. It's unfamiliar, it's uncomfortable. There are a few people in the population, relatively few, who are easily able to do it with both hands. We call them ambidextrous. They can use both hands. In a sense, this is the skill we need in our organizations. The skill to work this side of the tracks, the mainstream innovation, but also to learn these new tools to work that side, and to build a bridge between the two. Because this is a very interesting space, but as I think I've sketched, in Looking Glass World, you're playing by very different rules. It's very entrepreneurial. It's not like the day-to-day of this side of the tracks. So how do we build the bridges? And my use of the word, the innovation orchestra, in a sense, in large organizations, it's not just one group who do all the innovation. There are different sites responsible for different aspects. The mainstream, the big customer-connected R&D-led, the experimental entrepreneurs, the user bit, the whole workforce mobilized with incremental innovation, they're all players in an orchestra. The challenge is to make sure they are able to play their part well, whatever instrument they're playing, but also that we link them together. And it may not be a script and a master conductor. It may be more like a jazz band, which is my preference. But again, there's still a sense of something coordinating all of that. Okay, so I'm going to summarize and then take a musical cue, if I can, for the last 3 minutes. Okay? So very briefly, you wouldn't be here if you didn't believe innovation mattered. It's about survival and growth. And that isn't going to happen by accident. It needs active management. But just putting in place systems and processes may not be enough. We've got a moving target. So we're all of us, to some extent, trying to work in Looking Glass World. For that, we need this ability to step back, what we call in academic terms dynamic capability. Step back and reset our innovation models. And it's a challenge these days across a whole system, which requires us to rethink our approaches. 3 questions, dynamic capability. Of the things we do, which ones should we carry on doing, do more of, because they work? Of the things we do, which ones were good in the past, but perhaps we should let go, do less of, or even stop? And which new ones do we need to learn? So it's all about learning new tricks. And so I started with a children's book. I shall finish with one. This is another of my favorites. This is Winnie the Pooh. Christopher Robin, you might remember Walt Disney's version, but this is the original drawings from the original book of Winnie the Pooh. And for me, this always says something very powerful about learning. Very first page of the very first book, published just about 100 years ago, we're introduced to Winnie the Pooh in the following way. Here is Edward Bear, that's Winnie the Pooh's proper name, coming downstairs now, bump, 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 on the back of his head, behind Christopher Robin, which is, as far as he knows, the only way of coming downstairs, except that sometimes he feels there really is another way, if only he could stop bumping for a moment to think of it. I think that's really powerful, but bring it back to today. The great thing about an event like this is you're offline. You're not bumping your heads. You've got the chance to think. You've got people to bounce ideas around with. You've got real learning opportunity. So hopefully you're going to have a good conference. However, I'd like, as a teacher, to make sure you heard my message. One of the things I've learned over teaching is that actually, if you tell a message in one way, people take it in. If you tell it again in a different way, they might remember a bit more. So with your indulgence, and with the last 3 minutes, I do promise, I'd like to change. And I'm afraid you were warned. I'd like, if I may, to get this all to work. Sorry about the sounds. Great. Okay. So, here we go. Right. So I've been talking a lot about the challenge of dynamic capability. So just to hopefully fix that in your minds and maybe give you something to sing along with, because it does have a chorus, a little bit of dynamic capability, right? This is going to be interesting. I have to keep changing my slides, but okay, right. You like to think you're sitting on top of your technology. Your badges are smart and cool 'cause you do lots of R&D. Your software's good and your data's the best. Your packaging's cool, you can't forget all the rest. There's only one problem left at your door. Folks don't want your product no more. Here's the chorus. So you need dynamic capability. In innovation, it's got to be dynamic capability at the heart of your philosophy. You can't rely on the old routines to deal with problems that you've never seen. In innovation, the key to creation is to keep on building up your dynamic capability. You can sing that bit. Dynamic capability. There we go. Almost seamless. Are you really using all the knowledge that's out there? Trying new ways to open up, learning how to share. Not all the smart guys work for you. You need to network, let their ideas come through. If you're not ready to trade what you know, it might not just be your innovation that's closed. So you need dynamic capability. In innovation, it's got to be dynamic capability at the heart of your philosophy. You can't rely on the old routines to deal with problems that you've never seen. In innovation, the key to creation is to keep on building up your dynamic capability. Dynamic capability. One more. What? I need an assistant for this, probably. When Henry Ford started making cars, we didn't have a voice. But these days we don't just want Model Ts, we want lots of choice. We're all looking for customization. Out on the streets, the word is co-creation. Leaders can innovate, give them their say, but if you won't listen, they'll just walk away. So what you need is dynamic capability at the heart of your philosophy. Dynamic capability. In innovation, it's got to be. You can't rely on the old routines to deal with problems that you've never seen. In innovation, the key to creation is to keep on building up your dynamic capability. Now, I could carry on. In fact, if you think about it, we have a whole alphabet of innovation challenges. There's them, A to Z of innovation challenges. However, relax, because I'm not going to go through all of those. I am going to stop, but perhaps we could finish, and maybe you might remember the one key theme from my talk, dynamic capability. One more time then. Dynamic capability. In innovation, it's got to be dynamic capability at the heart of your philosophy. We can't rely on the old routines to deal with problems that we've never seen. In innovation, the key to creation is to keep on building up your dynamic capability. Dynamic capability. Dynamic capability. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thanks.